the midnight mourner. When I took the night shift at Fairhaven Funeral Home, I thought it would be quiet and uneventful. The first week passed without issue, though the stillness of the building always felt oppressive. But on my seventh night, I noticed something unusual. At exactly midnight, the door to the chapel opened. Startled, I peeked inside and saw a woman sitting in the front row. She was dressed in black, her veil covering her face. I didn't remember seeing her enter, but I assumed she was grieving a loved one. I didn't want to disturb her, so I quietly returned to the office. The next night, she was there again, seated in the exact same spot. This time, I decided to approach her. "Ma'am, the chapel is closed at night," I said gently. She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. When I reached out to touch her shoulder, my hand passed through her as if she were made of smoke. Terrified, I stumbled back. The woman vanished before my eyes, and the room grew unbearably cold. The next day, I asked my manager about it. He looked uncomfortable and finally admitted that years ago, a grieving mother had died of a heart attack during her son's funeral. "Sometimes," he whispered, "she comes back, looking for him." Now, every night at midnight, I hear the door creak open and feel her presence. I don't dare enter the chapel anymore, but I know she's waiting, forever searching for the son she lost. 2. The body in the wrong casket. It started as a simple mistake, or so I thought. During a busy week at the funeral home, we accidentally placed the wrong body in the wrong casket. By the time we realized, the funeral had already begun. Overseers, I decided to fix the mistake after hours. Alone in the embalming room, I opened the casket to move the body. As I reached for it, the lights flickered, and the room filled with the scent of decayed flowers. The body's eyes snapped open, milky and staring. Her selfie and froze as its lips moved, forming words that were barely a whisper. The lights went out entirely, and the air grew icy. When they came back on, the body was sitting upright, pointing a bony finger toward the corner of the room. There I saw another casket, the one it was meant to be in. Shaking, I moved the body to the correct casket. As soon as I closed the lid, the oppressive cold lifted, and the room returned to normal. But every now and then, when I pass by the embalming room, I hear faint whispers. Not my place. 3. The Whispering Morgue. The Seabrook Funeral Home, the morgue was located in the basement, a cold, sterile place that always felt wrong. I'd heard rumors about strange occurrences down there, but I dismissed them as superstitions until I worked the overnight shift. As I prepared a body for embalming, I heard faint whispers coming from the far corner of the room. Thinking someone had come in, I called out, "Hello." The whispers stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. Minutes later, the whispers began again, louder this time. They weren't in any language I recognized, more like a chorus of voices speaking all at once. I turned to find the body I was working on sitting up, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. I screamed and ran upstairs. When I returned with my supervisor, the body was back on the table, perfectly still. My supervisor laughed it off as exhaustion, but I know what I saw. Now, whenever I work in the morgue, I hear the whispers growing louder, and I know that one day they'll drown out everything else. 4. The Unfinished Funeral. Years ago, Fairview Funeral Home hosted a funeral that ended in disaster. During the service, a freak storm caused the building to flood. The casket was washed away, and the deceased was never properly laid to rest. When I took a job there, I didn't know about the history. But on my second night, I heard water dripping in the chapel. When I went to investigate, I found puddles forming along the aisle, though no pipes were leaking. The room grew colder, and I saw wet footprints leading to the altar. Then the sound of sobbing filled the air. I turned to see a woman standing at the casket. Her clothes were soaked, and water streamed from her hair. She turned to me, her face pale and bloated, her eyes black as ink. "Finish it," she croaked, pointing to the casket. The next day, I convinced the manager to hold a small memorial service for the deceased, finally laying them to rest. The strange occurrences stopped, for a while, but now, on stormy nights, I sometimes see her reflection in the puddles, waiting for someone else to help her find peace. 5. The Laughing Coffin. During a slow week at the funeral home, we received a custom-built casket from a local carpenter. It was beautifully crafted but strange. The wood was dark and gnarled, and faint carvings of faces adorned the sides. It was that night. As I was closing up, I heard faint laughter coming from the casket. It was soft at first, almost like a child's giggle, but it grew louder and more menacing. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but when I approached, the lid creaked open on its own. The side was empty, except for deep scratches on the interior, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. I demanded that the casket be returned, but the carpenter insisted it was harmless. "It's old wood," he explained. "Maybe it remembers." We used the casket for a burial the next day. That night, the laughter returned, this time echoing from the cemetery. I haven't been back since. 6. The ghost in the viewing room. Every employee at Middleton Funeral Home knows about the viewing room ghost. It's always cold, no matter how high the thermostat is set. But the strangest part is the mirrors. They never show the same reflection twice. One night, while preparing for a service, I caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. When I looked, I saw a man standing behind me, dressed in a suit and tie. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, he was still there, his eyes fixed on mine. Then he smiled, revealing teeth that were impossibly sharp. The next day, I found out the room had been used for a funeral decades ago where the wrong body was cremated by mistake. The family had been furious, and rumors swirled that the spirit of the deceased remained, haunting the mirrors in search of justice. Now, whenever I work in the viewing room, I avoid looking at the mirrors. But sometimes, I catch glimpses of that man's sharp-toothed grin, waiting for someone to set him free. 7. The body collector. One rainy night, the funeral home received an unusual delivery. A coroner's van pulled up late, well past closing hours. I didn't recognize the driver. A tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a hollow voice. "Got one for you," he said, dragging a body bag from the back. Something about the bag felt off. It was unusually large, and as he placed it on the embalming table, I noticed the material pulsing faintly, almost as if it were breathing. "What's the name of the deceased?" I asked. The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a grim smile. "Does it matter?" he whispered, before walking out without another word. Left alone, I hesitated but finally unzipped the bag. Inside was wrong. The body was bloated and twisted, its skin mottled black and blue, but the eyes were open, staring straight at me. As I leaned closer, the eyes shifted. Then it spoke. "Where are the others?" I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of tools. The body sat upright, its head tilting unnaturally. It repeated the question, louder this time, the voice distorted and echoing. Panicking, I bolted for the door, but the body was suddenly standing in my way, its movements jerky and inhuman. Before I could scream, it lunged at me, but instead of grabbing me, it tore open the body bag, and inside spilled dozens of severed limbs, heads, and torsos, stitched together as if trying to form some grotesque whole. The lights flickered, and the room filled with a cacophony of screams. When the power came back, everything was gone. No body, no limbs, no signs of the coroner's van. I reported it to my manager, who brushed it off as stress, but every few nights, I hear knocking at the back door. When I look through the peephole, I see the gaunt driver, waiting patiently. The forgotten room. When I started at the Morton Funeral Home, I noticed a locked door in the basement. My boss was firm. "That room stays locked. Don't ask questions." But curiosity got the better of me one night. Using a set of old keys I'd found in a drawer, I unlocked the door. Inside was a small, dusty room filled with ancient, rotting caskets. The air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. At the center of the room was a large, ornate coffin, its wood blackened and carved with strange symbols. I shouldn't have opened it, but I couldn't stop myself. The lid was heavy, and as I pried it open, I was hit with a blast of icy air. Inside lay a skeleton, its bones unnaturally white, as though they had been bleached by centuries of darkness. Its hollow eye sockets seemed to stare straight into my soul. Then the whispers began. They came from all around me, rising in volume until they became a deafening chant. The skeleton's jaw moved, its teeth chattering as though it were trying to speak. Suddenly, the coffin lid slammed shut with a force that knocked me to the floor. The room grew colder, and I heard a voice, guttural and ancient, echoing in my mind. "You have disturbed my rest." The door slammed shut, and I spent hours pounding on it, screaming for help. before it finally opened on its own. My boss found me curled in a corner, shaking uncontrollably. He didn't say a word, just locked the door and walked away. Now, I hear the whispers every time I pass the basement stairs. I know that whatever I disturbed in that room hasn't forgiven me. 9. The last funeral. The Jenkins funeral home had been abandoned for years when I was hired to help renovate it. My boss wanted to reopen the place, claiming it was a gold mine waiting to be tapped. On my second day, I found an old ledger in the office. It listed dozens of funerals, but the last entry caught my eye. The Clark funeral. Cancelled. It was crossed out in red ink, with the words "Do not attempt" written beside it. That night, I stayed late to finish cleaning the chapel. As I worked, I heard the faint sound of organ music. I thought I was imagining it until the sound grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. I followed the music to the embalming room. Inside, the lights flickered, and I saw a casket in the center of the room. I hadn't put it there, and I was sure it hadn't been there earlier. Curious, I opened the casket. It was empty, but the faint smell of rot wafted out. Then, the room grew icy cold, and the music stopped abruptly. The silence was broken by a voice behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around to see a man standing in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt. He wore an old-fashioned suit, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Before I could move, the casket lid slammed shut, and the man vanished. The next morning, I told my boss about what had happened. He went pale and muttered, "The Clark funeral." I quit that day, but I can't shake the feeling that the funeral home didn't want to be reopened, and that it succeeded in scaring me away. 10. The mirror coffin. During a busy week at the funeral home, we received a custom casket from an eccentric family. It was made entirely of reflective black glass, polished to a mirror-like shine. The family insisted it remain sealed at all times. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a closer look at the casket after hours. The glass surface was unnervingly perfect, reflecting the room in chilling detail. When I leaned closer, I noticed something strange. My reflection was smiling, though I was startled. I stepped back, but my reflection didn't move. It continued to smile, its teeth unnaturally sharp. Then it raised a hand and pointed at the casket. The lid creaked open, though I hadn't touched it. Inside, instead of a body, was a black void, as though the casket led to another dimension. My reflection began to climb out of the glass, its smile widening. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. When I returned with a coworker, the casket was sealed, and the reflection looked normal. But now every time I see myself in a mirror, I notice subtle differences. An eye twitch, a lingering smile. Try to convince myself it's my imagination, but the differences are becoming harder to ignore. Sometimes I catch my reflection moving when I'm completely still, tilting its head, watching me with an unsettling curiosity. Last night, as I was brushing my teeth, my reflection mouthed words I couldn't hear. Its eyes filled with malice. Then, it raised its hand again, pointing at me through the mirror. When I turned away, I felt a cold breath on my neck. The fluorescence covered every mirror in my home, but the black, polished surface of that casket still haunts my dreams. I know it's waiting for me to look again, waiting for the moment it can replace me entirely. 11. The smiling undertaker. The funeral home had a portrait of its founder, Harold Wilkes, prominently displayed in the foyer. The painting depicted him in his prime, a broad-shouldered man with a sharp smile that seemed to follow you wherever you went. One evening, while working late, I glanced at the portrait and noticed something strange. Harold's smile had grown wider, his teeth slightly bared. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the dim light, but when I looked again, his eyes were no longer looking forward. They were staring directly at me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but as the night went on, I couldn't escape the sense that I was being watched. I checked the portrait again. This time, Harold's hand was raised in a mocking wave. Panicked, I grabbed a ladder and took the painting down, planning to lock it in the storage room. As I carried it down the hall, I heard faint laughter. At first, I thought it was coming from my phone or the building's old pipes, but then the laughter grew louder, deep, guttural, and unmistakably human. When I locked the painting in the storage room, the door immediately began to rattle, as though someone inside was pounding to be let out. I ran back to the foyer, only to find the painting rehung on the wall, Harold's smile now a grotesque, toothy grin. Since then, I've refused to work late. Others have claimed they've seen Harold's reflection in the polished wood of caskets, grinning and watching them work. The painting can't be taken down anymore. Every time someone tries, it ends up back in the foyer by the next morning, Harold smiling wider than ever. 12. The funeral that never ended. The Fergusons hired the funeral home for their father's service. It was a simple affair, closed casket, a few mourners, and a quiet burial. But something felt off about the entire process. As the family gathered for the final viewing, a strange noise came from inside the casket. It sounded like faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. The family dismissed it as an old coffin settling, but I knew better. After the service, when everyone had left, I approached the casket to investigate. As I placed my hand on the lid, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the lid burst open, and I stumbled back, gasping in horror. The body wasn't decomposing. It was alive. Its eyes were wide, its mouth moving silently as if trying to scream. I slammed the lid shut and called the authorities, but when they arrived, the body was perfectly still, lifeless again. For weeks after, strange things happened around the funeral home. Lights flickered and faint tapping could be heard from empty rooms. Worst of all, I began seeing the deceased man in odd places. Standing by the embalming table, peering through the window at night, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The Fergusons eventually moved their father's casket to another funeral home, but the hauntings didn't stop. I can't shake the feeling that his funeral never truly ended, and now, I'm the one keeping vigil. 14. The Weeping Vault. The funeral home's oldest crypt, nicknamed the Vault, was rarely used anymore. It had been built centuries ago and was located deep underground, accessible only through a creaking staircase. No one liked going down there. It always smelled of damp earth and mildew, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnels. I was tasked with preparing the vault for a last-minute burial. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something strange. The further I went, the colder it became, and the sound of dripping water was replaced by something else. Faint sobbing. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I moved closer, the sobbing grew louder, unmistakably human. I called out, but no one answered. When I reached the crypt, the sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I replaced the coffin in its slot and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I banged on the door, screaming for help. Then I heard it again, the sobbing, now right behind me. When I turned, I saw a woman in a tattered black dress standing near the coffin. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She wept silently, her bony hands clutching her chest. "He's not here," she whispered, her voice cracked and mournful. "Where did you take him?" Her side bolted for the door, which somehow opened on its own. When I told my boss, he paled and said, "That's why we don't use the vault. That woman's son was buried elsewhere, and she's been searching for him ever since. Now, even when it's empty, I hear the sobbing echoing up the stairs, and I wonder how long she'll keep searching." 15. The Breathing Coffin. Her shipment arrived late. A simple pine coffin for a pauper's burial. It was unremarkable, plain and unfinished, but something about it made me uneasy. When I touched the lid, it felt warm, almost like skin. I shrugged it off and placed the coffin in the preparation room. But as I turned to leave, I heard a faint, rhythmic sound, like shallow breathing. I froze. The breathing grew louder, raspy, and uneven. I pressed my ear to the coffin, my heart racing. "Is someone in there?" I whispered. The breathing stopped. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, 3 loud knocks came from inside the coffin. For panicking, I grabbed a crowbar and pried the lid open. The coffin was empty, but the wood inside was splintered and clawed, as if someone, or something, had been trying to escape. The next day, I refused to use the coffin, but my manager insisted. At the burial, as we lowered it into the ground, the dirt on the grave began to shift. Faint breathing could be heard beneath the soil, and one mourner swore they saw the lid move. Now, whenever I pass the graveyard, I hear the same raspy breathing. It's as if the coffin is waiting for someone to come back and let it out. 16. The Funeral Without a Family. The funeral home received an unusual request, a prepaid service with no listed family or mourners. The instructions were clear. Hold the funeral at midnight, no exceptions. Curious, I stayed late to oversee the event. At exactly midnight, the front doors opened on their own, and a chilling wind swept through the room. The candles flickered and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. Then they arrived. Figures dressed in black robes filed into the room, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. None of them spoke, but their presence was suffocating. The casket was closed as per the instructions, but as the ceremony began, it started to shake violently. The robed figures stood still, silently watching. I was about to intervene when the lid burst open, and a black mist poured out, filling the room with an unbearable stench. The mist coalesced into a humanoid shape, its glowing red eyes scanning the room. One of the robed figures stepped forward and whispered something in a language I didn't understand. The figure in the mist nodded, then vanished back into the casket. The robed figures left without a word, and the room fell silent. The next morning, the casket was gone, and my boss refused to answer any questions. But every midnight since, I hear the faint sound of chanting in the funeral home, and I know they'll be 17. The crying child. Late one evening, I was alone in the funeral home when I heard a child crying. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. I followed the sound to the viewing room, where a small casket was laid out for a service the next day. The crying was louder here, almost unbearable. I opened the casket, expecting to find something inside, but it was empty. Then, behind me, I heard a soft voice. "Where's my mommy?" I turned to see a little girl standing in the doorway. Her dress was tattered, her hair matted, and her eyes were dark, sunken pits. "Where's my mommy?" she repeated, her voice growing more distorted with each word. Her face twisted into a horrifying grimace as she screamed, "Where is she?" The lights flickered, and the room filled with the sound of children crying. When the lights came back on, the girl was gone, but the faint outline of a child's handprint was burned into the casket lid. I've since heard the crying on several occasions, always near children's services. I think the girl is searching for her mother, and I pray she never finds me instead. 18. The Phantom Undertaker. The old embalming room hadn't been used in years, but rumors persisted that it was haunted. Staff claimed to see shadowy figures or hear the sound of tools clinking when no one was around. One night, I decided to investigate. As I entered the room, I felt a heavy presence, as though I were being watched. The tools on the table were neatly arranged, though no one had worked there in decades. As I approached, a scalpel rolled off the table and landed at my feet. Then the temperature dropped, and I saw him. A man in a blood-stained apron standing at the far end of the room. He was tall, skeletal, and his face was obscured by shadows, though his glowing white eyes pierced the darkness. He didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. I froze, unsure whether to run or scream. Then he slowly raised his hand, pointing to the embalming table. The tools began to rattle, rising off the table as if pulled by invisible strings. The man's voice echoed through the room, low and distorted. "Finish what I started." I didn't understand, but as I backed toward the door, the embalming table shifted, its metal legs screeching against the floor. The drawers flew open, spilling decades-old tools onto the ground. The Phantom Undertaker stepped closer, his form flickering like a dying flame. "Finish it," he growled, his voice filling my head. I ran, slamming the door behind me, but the sound of clinking tools followed me down the hall. The next morning, I found the embalming room spotless, as though it had been freshly used. Now late at night, I hear the Phantom Undertaker's footsteps pacing the hallways. I know he's waiting for someone to finish whatever terrible work he left undone. 19. The hands beneath the floor. Worse, in the oldest section of the funeral home, the floorboards creaked constantly. It was an irritation for most, but one I barely noticed until I worked a late shift away. As I passed through the hall, the creaking grew louder, almost rhythmic, as though someone were walking directly beneath me. I paused, kneeling to inspect the floorboards. The sound stopped abruptly. I thought it was just old wood, but then I saw it. A pale, bony hand reaching up through the crack between the boards. It clawed at the wood, scratching deep grooves into the surface before retreating. Horrified, I pried up a board to see what was beneath. The stench hit me first, a foul combination of rot and damp earth. Beneath the floor was a network of shallow tunnels, barely big enough to crawl through. In the dim light, I saw them. Dozens of hands, pale and skeletal, reaching up toward me. They moved slowly, as if blind, feeling for something. For me, I scrambled to replace the board, but the hands began to push upward, splintering the wood. I ran to get my manager, but when we returned, the floor was intact, the scratches gone. He dismissed my story, but I avoid that section of the funeral home now. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear faint scratching beneath my feet, and I know the hands are still there, waiting for their chance. 20. The silent pallbearers. It was my first time working in graveside service. The casket was simple, the mourners few, but what struck me most were the pallbearers. They arrived unannounced. 6 men dressed in identical black suits, their faces pale and expressionless. No one seemed to know who they were, not even the family of the deceased. When the service began, they moved in perfect unison, carrying the casket as though it weighed nothing. As they lowered the casket into the grave, I noticed something strange. Their hands didn't release the handles. They just stood there, motionless, holding onto the casket even as dirt was shoveled in. When the burial was complete, the pallbearers stepped back, their movements eerily synchronized. They turned to face me, their blank eyes locking onto mine. One of them whispered, "It's not over." Then, without another word, they walked away, vanishing into the surrounding woods. That night, I dreamt of the grave. In my dream, the dirt shifted, and the casket rose to the surface. The lid opened, revealing not the deceased, but one of the pallbearers, his pale face staring at me with dead eyes. I've since noticed those same men at other funerals, always appearing without explanation, always watching. I don't know who they are, but I'm terrified they're waiting for me to join them. Thank you for watching these spine-chilling tales. If you enjoyed the stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more dark and eerie content. Got a favorite story or your own haunted experience to share? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay safe and stay scared.